The night Lillian Ford knocked on her neighbor's door to borrow a lantern was the night her whole life quietly changed direction, though she would not understand that until much later, when she was sitting on a porch swing with calloused hands laced through hers, and the smell of juniper smoke drifting across the Arizona Territory sky. It was the autumn of 1882, and the town of Harlow Creek sat pressed between two red mesa walls like a letter folded into an envelope, waiting to be sent somewhere it had not yet been addressed. The railroad had come through 3 years prior, dragging with it a general store, a telegraph office, a saloon that never quite closed, and a steady parade of men who thought they could turn red dirt into gold if they just pushed hard enough. Some of them stayed. Most moved on. The ones who stayed were either stubborn or in love, and in Harlow Creek those two things were often the same. Lillian Ford was 24 years old that autumn. With dark brown hair she wore in a braid so long it brushed the small of her back, and eyes the color of creek water in October, green and gray and shifting depending on what the light was doing. She had come to Harlow Creek 2 years earlier with her father, Thomas Ford, who had purchased a small cattle spread just north of town with the money he had been saving since before the war. Thomas had been a good man, patient and funny and smelling always of cedar and boot leather, and he had died of fever the previous spring before the cattle operation had turned a real profit, leaving Lillian with a house, a vegetable garden, 11 head of cattle, and a debt to the Harlow Creek Bank that required her to sell one cow every 2 months just to stay current on the payment. She was not a woman who invited pity. She had taken on seamstress work for 3 families in town, traded eggs from her 4 chickens for flour and salt, and learned to repair her own fence line using a technique her father had taught her when she was 12 and watching him work by lantern light. She was also, and this mattered, a woman who paid attention to the people around her, which was perhaps why she noticed Marcus Cooper before most other people in Harlow Creek had even learned his name. Marcus Cooper had arrived in late September, riding in from the direction of Tucson on a dark bay horse that moved with the kind of quiet confidence that matched its rider. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered and lean, with dark skin weathered by years under a western sun and hands that showed every kind of work they had ever done. He had a calm way of moving through a room that some people mistook for coldness and others recognized immediately as discipline. He had rented a room above the feed store from old Earl Hutchins, who charged him the same rate he charged everyone else, which in Harlow Creek was notable enough that Lillian had heard about it from the postmistress, Clara Webb, before the week was out. Marcus had come to Harlow Creek because he had heard there was honest work available at the Dunbar Ranch, which sat on the eastern edge of the valley and ran more head of cattle than any other operation in the territory. Tom Dunbar was known to hire based on skill rather than the color of a man's face, which was not as common as it should have been in 1882, and Marcus had spent enough years navigating the difference between ranchers who kept their word and those who did not to know that Dunbar was worth the ride from Tucson. He had started work the first week of October, and within a month Dunbar had promoted him to trail boss for the northern herd, which was the kind of recognition that men spent years trying to earn and Marcus had earned in weeks. Lillian first spoke to Marcus at the general store, where they had both reached for the last sack of cornmeal at the same moment, and then stood there with their hands 6 inches apart, each waiting for the other to say something. She had laughed first, a short surprised sound, and told him to take it. She could wait for the next delivery. He had said he would split it with her, which was such an unexpectedly practical solution that she had found herself smiling all the way home. They had exchanged pleasantries after that, the small, careful kind that neighbors exchange when they are both people who measure trust before they extend it. She knew he worked for Dunbar. He knew she was managing the Ford cattle spread alone. They nodded to each other on the main street of Harlow Creek, and sometimes stopped to exchange a few words about the weather or the state of the road north. which washed out in the rains and was always in need of grading. What Lillian did not know, not yet, was that Marcus had started taking the longer route back to his rented room after supper, the one that ran along the edge of the Ford property, because he liked the way her kitchen window glowed at night. He told himself he was stretching his horse's legs. He was not the kind of man who examined his own motives too closely when doing so might force him to admit something he was not yet ready to admit. The night of the borrowed lantern came in the first week of November. The temperature had dropped sharply in the late afternoon, the kind of cold that presses in under doors and makes candles gutter, and Lillian had gone out to check on her cattle and discovered that one of the lanterns she kept in the barn had shattered, probably knocked over by her most restless heifer, a broad-faced animal she had named Margaret against her father's advice. The second lantern had run dry of oil, and the evening had come on quickly with the heavy cloud cover rolling in from the north. She needed light to check the fence line on the east side, which she had noticed was leaning that morning, and which she could not afford to have cattle wander through. She walked the half-mile to Marcus Cooper's rented room above the feed store, which was the closest occupied dwelling in that direction, and knocked on the door at the bottom of the exterior stairs. He had answered with his shirt half-tucked, and a look of mild surprise that he quickly adjusted into something more composed. She had explained the situation plainly, which was how she explained most things, and he had gone back inside and returned with a good brass lantern that he handed to her without making her ask twice. She thanked him and walked home in the cold with the lantern cutting a warm orange circle across the frozen grass, and she fixed the fence by the light of Marcus Cooper's borrowed brass lantern, and she went to bed thinking that it had been a practical transaction and nothing more. But she had borrowed his lantern, and that meant he would have to come to collect it. He came 3 days later, on a Saturday evening when the sky had gone the particular purple-pink of a cold November sunset, the kind of sky that makes the whole world look like it has been painted by someone in a hurry before the light ran out. Lillian was in her kitchen when she heard the knock, her hands dusted with flour because she was making cornbread for her supper, and she wiped them on her apron and opened the door to find Marcus Cooper standing on her porch with his hat in his hands, and the collar of his sheepskin coat turned up against the wind. He said, simply, "I came to return to check if you were finished with the lantern." She looked at him for a moment in the failing light, at the way his breath made small clouds in the cold air, and the way he was looking at her with that careful, measured attention she had noticed before and never quite been able to dismiss. Her kitchen smelled like cornbread baking, and there was a pot of beans on the stove that had been simmering since noon, and the warmth from inside was pressing out past her into the cold evening, and she made a decision that she would later describe to Clara Webb as the most impulsive thing she had ever done in her life. She said, "The lantern's just inside. Come in while I get it. It's too cold to stand on a porch." He stepped inside. That was all it took, really, just a step across a threshold. Just the warmth of a kitchen and the smell of supper, and two people who had been noticing each other from a careful distance, suddenly sharing the same small space. He stood just inside the doorway while she went to the shelf where she had set the lantern, cleaned and refilled, because she was the kind of person who returned things in better condition than she had received them. The kitchen was modest but warm, with a cast-iron stove doing honest work in the corner, and a pine table with 2 chairs that her father had built the first winter they had spent in Harlow Creek. There was a shelf of books along one wall, which surprised Marcus, and then surprised him that it surprised him. There were dried herbs hanging from the low ceiling beams, sage and chamomile and something purple he did not recognize, and a quilt over the back of the chair nearest the window that was pieced together from what looked like old shirt fabric. "Your fence line," he said, because he had noticed it on his way up the drive. "The east section. I fixed it 3 nights ago," she said. "The post in the middle is still leaning. Another hard wind and you'll lose it." She turned and looked at him with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite annoyance and settled somewhere in between. "I know," she said. "I ran out of time that evening. I was planning to do it this weekend." "I could fix it," he said, and then appeared to be somewhat surprised by his own words, the way a man looks when he has said a true thing before he finished deciding whether to say it. She studied him for a moment. The cornbread had another few minutes before it needed to come out. The beans were ready. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the shutters in a way that made the kitchen feel even warmer by contrast. "Have you eaten supper?" she asked. He had not. He had been planning to eat at the boarding house where Earl Hutchins' wife served a plain meal on Saturday evenings, but this was clearly a better option in every measurable way, and Marcus Cooper, for all his discipline, was not a man who turned down good sense when it presented itself so plainly. "No," he said. "Sit down then," she said, and turned back to the stove. That was how it began. Not with grand declarations, or the kind of swooning romance that the dime novel's Clara Webb, kept behind the post office counter, described in florid detail. It began with cornbread and beans, and two people sitting across a pine table from each other in a warm kitchen, while the November wind pressed its face against the window glass and tried to get in. It began with conversation that started as practical and became something else by degrees, the way a river becomes the sea, not all at once, but so gradually that you cannot identify the exact moment it changed. He told her about the Dunbar Ranch, about the northern herd and the challenges of the range at this time of year, about his years in Tucson before this, and before that in Texas, where he had grown up on a small farm outside of San Antonio with his mother and two younger brothers. His father had died when Marcus was 16, and he had worked every kind of job available to a young black man in Texas in the 1870s, which was not a long list. He had learned to work cattle from a man named Ezekiel Johns, who had been the best horseman Marcus had ever known, and who had taught him that patience was not a passive quality but an active one, a thing you practiced the way you practiced a skill, deliberately and with attention. She told him about her father, about the way he had spoken of Arizona territory like it was a promise he needed to keep, about the cattle and the debt and the seamstress work, and the fact that she was determined to have the debt paid off within 2 years, even if she had to sell Margaret the heifer to do it. She talked about the books on her shelf, which had come from a schoolteacher in Ohio who had been her mother's friend, and who had sent a crate of them west when Lillian's mother died, because she thought Lillian should have something of her mother's world even if she was living in a different one. Her mother had died when Lillian was 9, and the books had been a strange consolation, full of worlds that were nothing like a cattle spread in Arizona territory, but which had taught Lillian to understand that the world was larger and more complicated and more full of possibility than the particular corner of it she happened to be standing in. Marcus listened to all of this with the quality of attention that Lillian found she had almost forgotten was possible in a person, the kind where someone is not already composing their response while you are still speaking, but is actually following every word you say to the place it leads. She found herself telling him things she had not told anyone in Harlow Creek, not even Clara Webb, who was as close to a friend as she had managed to make in 2 years of mostly working too hard to socialize. They sat at the table for 2 hours. The cornbread was eaten, and the beans were eaten, and Marcus stood to leave 3 separate times and found a reason to keep talking each time, and Lillian found reasons to keep the conversation going, asking another question just as he was reaching for his hat, and this went on until the fire in the stove had burned low, and she had to add another piece of wood, and he finally said, with genuine reluctance, that he needed to get back before Earl Hutchins locked the ground floor door. He picked up his hat and walked to the door, and she handed him the brass lantern, and he took it and went out into the cold night, and it was not until he was halfway down her porch steps that he realized the lantern was the one he had lent her, not the lamp he had carried himself from the feed store, and that the lantern he had arrived with was still sitting on her shelf. He stood on her porch steps in the dark and looked back at the kitchen window, at the warm light inside, and made a decision that a man less disciplined might have made without thinking, but which Marcus Cooper made with full awareness of what it meant. He did not knock again that night. He told himself he would collect it another time. He told himself there was no hurry. What he meant was that he wanted a reason to come back. He came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and by the third visit Lillian had stopped pretending to herself that she was not watching the road from the kitchen window around the time he usually arrived, and Marcus had stopped pretending to himself that he was making a social call in the spirit of neighborly courtesy. He had fixed the fence post that first Sunday morning, arriving with tools before she was fully awake and finishing the job while she made coffee, and he had done it with the focused efficiency of a man who is good at practical things and takes quiet satisfaction in that goodness. And Lillian had watched him from her kitchen window with a feeling in her chest that she did not name immediately, because she was sensible enough to know that feelings named too early have a habit of becoming something smaller than they started. By December, the town of Harlow Creek had noticed, as small towns invariably do. Clara Webb mentioned it to Lillian with the careful neutrality of a woman who has an opinion and is choosing her words. She said she hoped Lillian was being careful, which was a thing people said in 1882 when they meant several different things at once, and Lillian thanked her for her concern and said nothing further, because she was a woman who knew the difference between advice given from love and advice given from custom, and while she valued Clara's love, she was not obligated to follow custom in all its particulars. There were men in Harlow Creek who expressed their opinions more directly. Harlan Cross, who ran the saloon and had a way of making his business everyone else's business, said something in Marcus's hearing one evening that was designed to suggest Marcus was getting ideas above his station, which in Harlan Cross's vocabulary meant any black man who ate supper with a white woman and looked comfortable doing it. Marcus said nothing in response, which unsettled Harlan Cross more than any reply would have done, because Harlan Cross was a man who expected to provoke a reaction and had built his entire sense of power on the expectation that the world would respond to him predictably. Marcus simply looked at him for a long moment with those steady dark eyes and then walked out of the saloon, and Harlan Cross found himself feeling somehow diminished without having been able to explain why. Tom Dunbar heard about it and said nothing to Marcus except to ask if the northern fence line was ready for winter, which it was, because Marcus had organized the work with the same thoroughness he applied to everything. Dunbar was a practical man who understood that a good trail boss was worth more than whatever Harlan Cross thought about anything, and he had lived long enough in the territory to have a complicated relationship with the particular cruelties that passed for social order in small western towns. Lillian heard the talk, because in Harlow Creek it was impossible not to, and she felt a cold anger about it that she did not share with Marcus because she did not want him to think she was ashamed, which she was not for one single moment. What she was, she decided after a long consideration while mending a petticoat for Mrs. Dunbar, was protective. She was protective of the thing that was growing between her and Marcus Cooper, which was still too new and too tender to be exposed to the hard weather of other people's opinions. Marcus, for his part, had known hard weather of that particular kind his entire life, and had developed a skin for it that was not indifference but something more like a deep refusal to let other people's fear define the shape of his days. He had grown up watching his mother navigate a world that had been explicitly designed to diminish her, and had watched her do it with a dignity so complete and so undefended that it had become the template against which he measured his own conduct. He did not pretend the ugliness did not exist. He simply did not allow it to win. What was harder, what was genuinely harder, was the feeling that was developing in him every Saturday evening when he climbed Lillian Ford's porch steps and heard her moving inside the kitchen before she opened the door and the warmth and the light came out to meet him. It was harder because it was not something he had planned and not something he had a practiced defense against. He was good at his work, and he was good at knowing what the weather was going to do, and he was good at reading the way cattle moved when something had disturbed the range. But he was less practiced at the particular vulnerability of caring about someone, and not yet knowing if they cared in return. He did not know that she watched the road. She did not know he had ridden past her property 3 times the previous Thursday for no reason he could logically account for. It was Clara Webb, who had a sharp eye and a warm heart in roughly equal measure, who told Lillian outright in the second week of December that, in her professional opinion as someone who had watched 2 decades of courtship play out across the post office counter, Marcus Cooper was a man in the early stages of being in love with Lillian Ford, and that if Lillian felt anything similar she might consider making it slightly less difficult for him to say so. Because he struck Clara as a man who would wait a very long time out of respect before he said anything he was not sure would be welcome. Lillian thought about this for the rest of the week. On the following Saturday, Marcus arrived at his usual time, which was just as the light was going out of the sky, and Lillian opened the door before he had finished knocking and said, before he had fully stepped inside, "I want to tell you something, and I need to say it before I find a reason not to." He looked at her with those steady eyes, his hat in one hand, and the particular stillness about him that she had learned by now meant he was paying close attention. She said, "I look forward to Saturdays more than any other day of the week, and I have for over a month, and I thought you should know that." He stood on her porch in the cold December air and said nothing for long enough that she felt a twist of anxiety in her chest, the kind that arrives when you have said the true thing and are waiting to find out what the true thing costs. And then he said, quietly and with a warmth in his voice that she had not heard there before in quite that precise degree, "I have been riding past your property on Thursday evenings without a good reason." She looked at him. He looked at her. The wind moved between them like a sentence that did not need words. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold." He came inside, and he sat down at the pine table, and she made coffee, and they sat together in the kitchen while the winter dark pressed against the glass, and the fire burned steadily in the stove, and something between them shifted from what it had been to something fuller and warmer and more specific, the way a shape in fog becomes a solid thing as you walk toward it. He reached across the table that evening and took her hand, just held it with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and she turned her hand over and held his back, and that was the exact moment when Harlow Creek stopped being a place where Lillian Ford was managing alone and became a place where she was not. Christmas of 1882 was the best one Lillian had known since before her mother died, which was a thing she only understood in full when she was lying awake on Christmas night, listening to the quiet of the Ford house, with the small carved wooden bird Marcus had given her sitting on the table beside her bed. He had made it himself from a piece of juniper wood, carved it in the evenings after work with a small knife, and she had recognized it immediately as a meadowlark, which was the bird that had nested in the fence post nearest her kitchen window every spring. She had not told him about the meadowlark. He had just noticed. She had given him a scarf she had knitted from the best wool she could afford, in a dark red that she thought suited him, and he had worn it immediately and not taken it off for the rest of the afternoon, which Clara Webb, who had come for Christmas supper along with old Earl Hutchins and his wife, because Lillian had decided she was going to be the kind of person who hosted people even if her house was modest, reported later to the postmistress in Millrock as evidence of a man who was gone past help. Clara was not wrong. By January, Marcus and Lillian had settled into a rhythm that was closer to a partnership than a courtship, though it was both. He spent Sunday mornings at the Ford property helping with whatever needed doing, fence repairs and barn maintenance, and the steady work of keeping a small cattle operation functional through winter, and Lillian had started packing 2 lunches on those mornings without being asked, one for herself and one in a tin pail for Marcus, and they ate together in the barn when it was too cold to eat outside, sitting on upturned feed crates with the cattle shifting and breathing around them. Margaret the heifer had decided she approved of Marcus, which Lillian took as a significant endorsement. In the evenings, when weather and work allowed, he came for supper or she walked to town, and they sat in the small parlor of the boarding house where Earl Hutchins had developed the habit of finding reasons to be in another room when Marcus had a visitor, a kindness that Marcus noted and was grateful for in the particular way that people who have been treated unkindly are grateful for ordinary decency when they encounter it. They read together sometimes, Lillian reading from one of her books while Marcus sat across from her, and sometimes he read to her, which she had not expected and which she loved, because he had a deep, quiet voice that made even the practical passages of the Cattle Management Almanac Earl kept on the parlor shelf sound worth listening to. He told her more about Texas. He told her about his brothers, James and Samuel, who were both still in San Antonio, James working as a carpenter and Samuel farming the small piece of land their mother still lived on. He had not been back in 4 years, not since he had gone to work in Tucson, and there was something in the way he talked about them that made Lillian understand. He carried a particular kind of loneliness that was not about the present, but about the distance from a past that he had never fully been able to leave behind. She told him she understood that kind of longing, the way you could be perfectly all right in your life and still feel the absence of the people who had made you who you were, like a specific kind of weather, always there in the background. "I think your mother sounds extraordinary," she said one evening in late January, after he had told her about the way his mother had negotiated a better price for their cotton harvest from a buyer who had tried to underpay her, standing in his office in San Antonio with 2 children on her hip, and the arithmetic worked out in her head to the penny. Marcus looked at the fire for a moment. "She is the strongest person I have ever known," he said, "and I have known some strong people." He looked at Lillian when he said it, and she understood he was including her in that count, and she felt the warmth of that recognition settle somewhere in her chest like a piece of wood that had finally found the right fit. February arrived with the particular ferocity that the Arizona Territory winter occasionally mustered, when it wanted to remind people that beauty and harshness were not opposites but neighbors, and with it came 2 problems that tested the small world Lillian and Marcus had been building. The first was that the Harlow Creek Bank sent a letter informing Lillian that the rate of her debt repayment was satisfactory, but that the bank had been purchased by a holding company in Phoenix, and that under new management her loan terms were being reviewed, which was language that meant nothing good and everything bad. The second was that Harlan Cross, who had apparently not forgotten the particular indignity of being looked at and walked past, had taken his complaints about Marcus Cooper to a level that went beyond saloon talk into something with actual potential for harm. Harlan Cross had written a letter to Tom Dunbar suggesting that Marcus's relationship with a local woman was creating social disruption in Harlow Creek, and that Dunbar might want to consider whether his trail boss was the right fit for the operation. Dunbar had read the letter, and then used it to light his pipe, which was the exact response it deserved, and had told Marcus about it the following morning with the same tone he would have used to report that the north pasture gate needed a new hinge. Marcus thanked him and went back to work. But the fact that the letter had been written at all sat in the back of his mind like a splinter, not deeply embedded but present, a reminder that the world he and Lillian were building was subject to forces that had nothing to do with what either of them deserved. It was the bank problem that worried him more, because it was concrete, and it affected Lillian directly, and he understood debt, and what it meant to a small landowner better than most. He talked to her about it one Sunday afternoon in the barn while they were checking the winter feed supply, and she told him the details plainly, the way she always told him things, without softening them in a way that would have felt like a performance of fragility she did not possess. He thought about it for 3 days. On Wednesday evening, he rode to Mill Rock, which was the nearest larger town, and visited the land office there, where a man named Peterson kept records of territorial land transactions, and spent 2 hours reading documents that were publicly available but which most people in Harlow Creek did not know existed. He came back Thursday with information about the Phoenix Holding Company and its history of land acquisition in the territory, which was not encouraging reading, and he put together, on a piece of paper at his table above the feed store, a proposal that he brought to Lillian on Saturday evening. The proposal was this: if the bank under new management tried to change the loan terms in a way that was unfair, Lillian had the legal right under territorial law to challenge the terms, but she would need a lawyer, and the nearest territorial lawyer who had a reputation for taking on small landowners against holding companies was in Tucson, a man named Robert Cahill who Marcus had heard of through Tom Dunbar. Marcus had drafted a letter to Cahill laying out the facts, and he wanted Lillian's permission to send it. She read the letter and then looked at him across the table and said, "You spent 3 days on this." 2.5, he said. She was quiet for a long moment. Not because she was uncertain about the proposal, which was thoughtful and thorough and legally sound as far as she could tell, but because she was feeling something about the fact of it, about the fact of a man who had spent 2.5 days solving a problem that was hers to solve, who had done it not because she had asked, but because he saw it as naturally within the compass of what he could do for her. "Send the letter," she said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned it over and held on. Outside, the February wind was making its argument against the shutters, and the fire was burning well, and the lamp Marcus had forgotten 2 months ago was still on her shelf, its brass polished because Lillian kept things clean, and neither of them mentioned it, but it had become, without either of them formally acknowledging the fact, a permanent fixture of the kitchen. Robert Cahill wrote back in March. His letter was encouraging. He believed the holding company had a pattern of changing loan terms that violated the original territorial charter conditions, and he was willing to take the case on a contingency basis, meaning Lillian would not owe him anything unless they won. He asked her to come to Tucson with documentation of the original loan terms, the bank's letters, and any other relevant paperwork. Lillian and Marcus rode to Tucson together in March, a 3-day journey by horse through the territory, stopping at a way station on the first night and at a small boarding house in the settlement of Red Mesa on the second. It was the first long journey either of them had taken in the other's company, and it turned out to be one of the things that made what had been forming between them final and certain, the way that travel with someone tells you things about them that ordinary life keeps hidden. He was patient on the road, which she had expected. What she had not expected was that he was also funny, in a dry, quiet way that emerged when he was relaxed and away from the particular social calculations of Harlow Creek, making observations about the landscape and the behavior of their horses that made her laugh, until she had to hold the saddle horn for balance. She was not, it turned out, the most naturally patient traveler. She had a tendency to want to push the pace, to arrive faster than was comfortable for the horses, and he let her lead and then gently suggested, without making her feel corrected, that the horses would do better with a slower approach to the long upgrades. She took the suggestion and then apologized for the impatience, and he said that impatience was only a fault if it was all you had, and she had considerably more than that. They met Cahill on the 3rd morning, in a clean office on the main street of Tucson, and spent 4 hours reviewing documents. Cahill confirmed his initial assessment and took the case formally. He was a compact, brisk man in his 40s with reading glasses perpetually on his forehead, and a manner that suggested he had argued a great number of cases, and won enough of them to have developed a relaxed attitude toward the ones he expected to win. He seemed entirely unsurprised by Lillian and Marcus's presence together, which was either professional courtesy or genuine indifference, and either way was something Lillian appreciated. On the evening of the third day, in Tucson, they had supper at a restaurant that was more comfortable than anything available in Harlow Creek, with tablecloths and candles and a menu written in a hand that suggested the establishment took itself seriously. Marcus had put on his good shirt, and Lillian had worn the blue wool dress she had made for herself the previous autumn from fabric she had ordered from the catalog, and they sat across from each other in the candlelight and ate well and talked about things that were not debt or law cases or fence posts. Talked about the kind of things that people talk about when they have been steadily working toward each other for months and are finally in a place far enough from the usual pressure of their lives to simply be together without any agenda other than being together. He told her he had not felt this way about anyone before, and he said it in the direct, uncomplicated way he had of saying true things, looking at her across the table with those steady eyes. And she said that she had thought, after her father died, that she was going to be alone for a very long time, and that she had made her peace with that because it was better than the alternative of choosing badly out of loneliness, and that she was glad she had waited because she had not in fact made her peace with it. She had just been waiting without knowing what she was waiting for. He reached across the white tablecloth and she put her hand in his, and the candle between them moved in a small draft from the window, and outside on the streets of Tucson 1883 was proceeding with all its complicated noise. But inside that restaurant at that table, the world was very quiet and very specific and entirely sufficient. On the ride home from Tucson, Marcus asked her to marry him. He did not have a ring yet. He told her this directly, said he wanted to ask now rather than wait until he had the right material object because he did not want to let the feeling of the moment pass and reduce itself to logistics. He asked while they were riding side by side along a stretch of the road where the mesquite was in early flower, and the mountains were purple in the late afternoon distance, and the horses were walking easy, and Lillian pulled her horse to a stop and looked at him until he pulled his own horse to a stop and turned to face her. She said, "Yes," in a voice that was quieter than her usual voice, private in a way that felt like it belonged to just the two of them and the open desert around them and no one else. He let out a breath that he seemed to have been holding since before he asked the question, and she laughed at the sight of it, and he laughed too, and their horses, confused by the sudden human laughter in the middle of a quiet road, shifted and huffed in mild protest, which made them laugh harder, and they rode the rest of the way home with the kind of lightness that you cannot manufacture and cannot hold onto forever, but which, when it arrives, is the clearest possible evidence that something in your life has finally, truly gone right. They told Clara Webb first, because she had seen it coming and deserved to know first. Clara wept openly in the post office, which she would later deny, and then said she was putting an announcement in the next mail delivery to every address in Harlow Creek, because news like this needed to travel faster than gossip. Lillian and Marcus agreed to this on the condition that Clara's announcement was factual and not embellished, and Clara said she would do her best, which was not a promise of restraint, but was the most anyone could honestly offer. Tom Dunbar heard the news and shook Marcus's hand with the grip of a man who means it, and said that Marcus had better not let anything interfere with the spring cattle drive, and that he would need 3 days' leave for the wedding and could have them. Old Earl Hutchins said nothing, but came down from his rooms with a bottle of whiskey he had been saving since before the railroad came, and set it on the parlor table, which Marcus took as an adequate blessing. Harlan Cross heard the news and said things that are not worth repeating at length, because they were not worth listening to at the time and are worth even less now. And a number of people in Harlow Creek who had not previously expressed any opinion about Marcus Cooper or Lillian Ford heard what Harlan Cross said, and found that the saying of it revealed something about Harlan Cross's character that made them less inclined to give him their business or their company, which was not the outcome he had intended. The wedding was planned for May, when the territory was briefly and brilliantly in bloom between the cold of winter and the full heat of summer, when the cactus flowers were out, and the sky was the hard, deep blue that does not appear anywhere else on earth in quite that particular shade. They were married by the circuit preacher, Reverend Aldous Marsh, who came through Harlow Creek 4 times a year and who performed the ceremony in the open air behind Lillian's house, which was now, after a brief and practical legal transaction, also Marcus's house. Clara Webb stood up for Lillian. Tom Dunbar stood up for Marcus. Earl Hutchins sat in the front row of the small gathering of chairs and kept his handkerchief available in a way that suggested he had learned from Clara Webb's example. Lillian wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored cotton with small blue embroidery at the collar that she had done over the previous 2 months in the evenings after supper, and Marcus wore his good dark coat and the red scarf she had knitted him in December, which he wore loosely around his collar against the slight morning chill, and which made her smile when she saw it because she understood exactly what he was doing. Reverend Marsh was a man who had performed a great many frontier weddings and had developed a talent for making the ceremony feel specific to the people in it rather than a general procedure. He spoke about the territory and about what it meant to build a life in a place that asked so much of you, and about the particular courage of people who chose to do that building together. He looked at Lillian and Marcus when he spoke, and his voice had no performance in it, only the plain meaning of the words, and both of them listened with the same quality of attention they had always brought to the things that mattered. When Marcus said his vows, he said them slowly and with a precision that came from having thought carefully about each word, and his voice was steady and warm and entirely certain, the voice of a man who has made up his mind about the most important thing in his life and has no reservations about the having made it. When Lillian said hers, her voice was quiet and direct and full of something that was not fragility, but was the precise opposite of it, the kind of openness that only genuinely strong people can afford because they know they will not be destroyed by the vulnerability of it. Marcus kissed her, and Clara Webb cried again, and Margaret the heifer made a loud sound from the barn as if registering her approval, and Harlow Creek went on around them with all its ordinary business, while 2 people who had been changed by each other stood in the May morning and began the rest of their lives. The legal case against the Phoenix Holding Company was resolved in August, in Lillian's favor, which meant her original loan terms were restored, and the debt was to be paid on the original schedule, which she and Marcus had calculated they could clear 2 years ahead of schedule given their combined income from the Dunbar Ranch and the cattle and the seamstress work, which Lillian had kept up because she was good at it and enjoyed the practical satisfaction of it. Cahill wrote a brief letter saying the holding company had not put up much of a fight once the charter violation was clearly documented, and that he hoped she found the territory's legal provisions useful and was glad to have been of service. Marcus had Lillian read the letter aloud at the supper table and then said simply, "Good," in a tone that covered a considerable amount of quiet satisfaction. By the end of 1883, the Ford Cooper Ranch, which is what people had started calling the Ford property, though its official name was still the Ford Cattle Spread for the purposes of the Territorial Land Registry, had grown to 23 head of cattle, which was a significant improvement from the 11 Lillian had inherited. Achieved partly through Marcus's contacts at the Dunbar Ranch, and partly through a trade he had negotiated with a rancher in Red Mesa, who needed labor more than he needed young stock. The house had been expanded by a room, built over the summer by Marcus and Tom Dunbar on 2 Sundays in July, a plain, sturdy room with a window that faced the mountains because Lillian had said that was what she wanted, and Marcus saw no reason to argue with good judgment. Clara Webb came for supper on Thursday evenings, which had become a fixture of the week that all 3 of them had settled into with the ease of something that had always been the arrangement. She brought news and gossip in the ratio that was her natural disposition, and they received it with the same ratio of genuine interest and gentle skepticism. And after supper Marcus and Lillian and Clara sometimes played cards at the pine table, and sometimes simply talked while the fire burned, and outside the territory went about its business. In the spring of 1884, Lillian told Marcus she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, before he left for the Dunbar Ranch, standing in the kitchen with her coffee cup in both hands, and he stood very still for a moment with an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was the expression of a man who has wanted something so much and for so long that the arrival of it does not feel immediately real. Then he put his hand to her face carefully and she leaned into it, and he said quietly, "Good morning, then." She laughed until she had to set down the coffee cup. He was home before supper that day, which was unusual, and she did not ask why. The child was born in November, a boy they named Thomas James Cooper, Thomas for Lillian's father and James for Marcus's brother, and the naming was a deliberate bridge between two families and two histories that had been separated by distance and circumstance, but were now joined in the particular intimacy of this new person who had arrived with his father's dark eyes and his mother's expression of focused attention. And already, at 3 days old, what Clara Webb declared was her own grandmother's nose. Though she could not have said whose grandmother she meant, and everyone agreed it was the nose of someone with character. Marcus wrote to his brothers that week. The letter to James and Samuel was long, longer than his usual correspondence, and Lillian read it over his shoulder at the table and found that the section about Thomas James Cooper was the section where his handwriting, normally so careful and even, had become slightly larger, the way handwriting does when the hand is being moved by something stronger than penmanship. James Cooper arrived in Harlow Creek 4 months later, in the spring of 1885, ostensibly to see his nephew, but actually, as he admitted on his second evening at the Ford Cooper Ranch, with the directness that apparently ran in the family, because he had been living in San Antonio for 34 years and was interested in seeing whether the territory was worth what Marcus had written about it. He was a year younger than Marcus, with the same quality of stillness and his brother's way of looking at the world as a set of practical problems that could be addressed if you applied enough patient attention. James spent 2 weeks in Harlow Creek, during which he repaired 3 structural issues with the barn that Marcus had been planning to address, met Clara Webb at supper on a Thursday evening, and left at the end of the 2 weeks saying he needed to go back to San Antonio, but intended to return before summer. Clara Webb said nothing about this to Lillian, which was so unlike her usual behavior that it communicated everything. James returned in July and did not go back to San Antonio. The summer of 1885 was good. The cattle were healthy. The debt to the bank was ahead of schedule. Little Thomas was beginning to pull himself to standing using the furniture and examining the world from his new altitude with an expression of deep scientific interest. And Marcus had been offered a partnership in a small cattle operation near Millrock by a man who had worked alongside him on 2 Dunbar drives and trusted his judgment. The partnership would mean more work and more travel, but also more income, and they discussed it over 3 evenings at the supper table, Lillian and Marcus, with Thomas on Marcus's knee and the account spread across the table. And at the end of the 3rd evening, Lillian said she thought they should take it, because her father had come to Arizona Territory, because he believed the land here rewarded commitment, and she intended to prove him right. Marcus took the partnership. James Cooper, by this time, was living in a rented room at the boarding house that Earl Hutchins had not increased in price, despite the fact that the territory was generally getting more expensive, and was working as a carpenter in Harlow Creek, building things that people needed, and spending his Thursday evenings with considerable reliability in proximity to the post office, where Clara Webb found increasingly complex reasons to be at her counter when James happened to be passing. Lillian watched this development with the particular warmth of someone who recognizes what she is seeing, because she has felt it herself, and said nothing direct to either party on the grounds that the best thing you could do for 2 people who were finding their way toward each other was to clear the path and not stand in it. By the autumn of 1885, James and Clara were walking out together openly, which in Harlow Creek meant they went to the social at the Methodist church together and sat next to each other at the harvest supper, and were seen leaving at the same time. And Harlan Cross had something to say about this also, because Harlan Cross was a man with a great deal of something to say about everyone else's business. But by this point, the general opinion of Harlan Cross in Harlow Creek had been so thoroughly adjusted by the accumulation of his opinions that people simply changed the subject when he began one of his assessments, which was a more effective correction than argument would have been. Lillian had, over the course of 3 years in Harlow Creek, become someone that people came to for practical advice, which surprised her somewhat because she had never advertised herself as anything other than a person trying to keep a cattle operation running. But there was something about the way she listened, and the way she spoke plainly without reduction of complexity that made people trust her, and she found she had opinions about their problems that were sometimes useful, and this was satisfying in a way she had not anticipated. She was doing the seamstress work for 12 families by the end of 1885, which was more than she could reasonably manage, and which she was in the process of reducing by teaching 2 younger women in Harlow Creek the trade, not because she was being altruistic, though she was, but because she genuinely liked the idea of skills being passed on rather than hoarded, which was a value her father had tried to instill in her, and which she now understood more fully than she had when he was alive. Thomas James Cooper turned 2 in November of 1885, and showed every sign of becoming a person of strong opinions, which Marcus said was inevitable given the family he had been born into, and Lillian did not dispute this. He had his father's calm assessment of the physical world and his mother's impatience with obstacles, which was either going to make him very effective or very exhausting, and possibly both. In January of 1886, Lillian told Marcus she was expecting again. This time she told him in the evening, after Thomas was asleep, sitting by the fire, and he reached across and took her hand in the same way he had taken her hand at the pine table in December of 1882, with the same care, and the warmth between them had the quality of something that had deepened with use rather than diminished, the way good leather softens but does not weaken. The second child, born in August of 1886, was a boy they named Robert, after Cahill the lawyer in Tucson, who had never known he was going to have a baby named for him, and who received the news in a letter from Lillian with a gratitude that he expressed in his reply in 3 lines, because he was not a man of many words, but the 3 lines were sufficient. Robert was louder than Thomas from the first hour of his life, and showed no signs of quieting down, which Thomas, now nearly 3, regarded with a mixture of scientific interest and fraternal skepticism. Earl Hutchins died in the spring of 1887. He was 71 years old and had seen the railroad come and the town grow, and had rented his room above the feed store at a fair price, and had set a bottle of whiskey on a parlor table when it was needed, and had, in his own uncommunicative way, been a decent presence in the life of Harlow Creek. Marcus sat with him in the last 3 days, going after his shift on the ranch and staying until late, reading to him from the almanac, because it turned out Earl had a fondness for almanacs that no one had known about, and Lillian brought soup that Earl mostly did not eat but seemed comforted by the presence of. He died on a Tuesday morning with no one in the room, which was probably how he would have chosen it. His property passed to a nephew in Flagstaff who came to survey it and decided to sell the building, and the feed store below changed hands twice in the following year. But what mattered was that James Cooper bought the rooms above from Earl's nephew for a price that was fair. And 3 months later, in the autumn of 1887, James and Clara Webb were married by Reverend Marsh in the same spot behind the Ford Cooper Ranch where Marcus and Lillian had been married 4 years earlier. And the carpet of late-season wildflowers was not quite the same as the May bloom but was, Clara declared, entirely sufficient. The brass lantern was still on the shelf in Lillian's kitchen. No one had ever formally addressed its status as a borrowed item that had been forgotten and then never quite returned. It had simply become part of the kitchen, as permanent as the stove and the pine table, and occasionally Lillian lit it when the regular lamp was needed elsewhere, and its warm brass circle of light moved across the room the same way it had moved across the frozen November grass on the night she had borrowed it to fix a fence, which felt now like something that had happened in a different life, or rather, like the beginning of the life she was actually in. Which was how beginnings work when you look back at them from a sufficient distance. Marcus noticed one evening in the winter of 1887 that Lillian was looking at the lantern with an expression that meant she was thinking about something. He asked her what it was. She said, "Do you remember why you came here the first time? You came to collect the lantern." He looked at the lantern on the shelf. He looked at Lillian in her chair by the fire with 2-year-old Robert asleep in her lap and Thomas visible through the doorway, sitting on the floor of the parlor with the determined posture of a person teaching himself to read. He looked at the kitchen around him, at the dried herbs and the books and the pine table and the 2 chairs that her father had built, which he had repaired twice in the years since and which were now stronger than they had originally been. "I did come to collect it," he said. "You left it behind," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I know," she smiled. "On purpose." He took a long moment before answering, the way he took long moments before saying things that were true and important. "I wanted a reason to come back," he said. She looked at the lantern again, and then at him, and the fire moved in its grate and Robert made a small sleeping sound and Thomas turned a page in the parlor. And outside the winter night was doing what the Arizona Territory winter did, pressing its cold face against the glass of the kitchen window, and inside the kitchen was warm and full and entirely sufficient. "You always had a reason," she said. "You just needed to know it." He crossed the kitchen and sat in the chair beside her and put his arm around her, carefully so as not to wake Robert, and she leaned against him the way she had been leaning against him for 4 years. Not as a person who needed support, but as a person who had found someone worth leaning toward. The years that followed in Harlow Creek were not without difficulty, because nothing in the territory was without difficulty, but they were years with a particular quality that was recognizable as happiness even in the midst of the difficulties, the way certain kinds of light are recognizable regardless of what they fall on. The Millrock partnership expanded, and then stabilized into something sustainable, and Marcus managed it with the patient thoroughness that had always been his signature approach to any complex system. He hired 2 men in the years following, both young and green and willing to learn, and he taught them the way Ezekiel Johns had once taught him, with patience and specificity, and the clear understanding that skill was something you earned by practice and not by declaration. Lillian completed the debt payment to the Harlow Creek Bank in the spring of 1888, 18 months ahead of the revised schedule, and more than 2 years ahead of what would have been the original schedule without the legal intervention. She sent the final payment with a brief note to the bank manager, thanking him for the bank's patience, and noting that she hoped the institution's new management would continue to honor the original charter terms with all its borrowers, which was not a threat but was not a threat, and which the bank manager read twice and filed carefully. She told Marcus about it at supper, sliding the paid-in-full receipt across the pine table with the satisfaction of a woman who has been working toward a thing for 4 years and has arrived at its completion. He looked at it and then looked at her and said, very quietly, "Your father would have liked knowing this." She had to look at the window for a moment. "Yes," she said. He would have. They sat together at the table after the boys were in bed, the way they often sat, the fire burning and the lamp lit and the brass lantern on its shelf, catching the light in the way brass does, warm and particular, and they talked about Thomas Ford, and about Marcus's mother, and about the various people who had made them who they were, The way you talk about the dead when you are living well enough that their absence has become something you can hold without being crushed by it. In the summer of 1888, Marcus finally made the journey to San Antonio. He had been planning it since Robert was born, kept delaying it for the kind of practical reasons that accumulate around a person with work and family. And in June, he rode to Tucson and boarded the Southern Pacific Rail line that would take him east. And it was the first time he had been on a train in 8 years. And he sat in the car watching the territory go past through the window and thought about the distance between who he had been at 20 and who he was now, which was considerable. And which he felt in the specific way you feel a good distance when you have covered it with intention. He was gone 3 weeks. Lillian managed the ranch and the boys and the Thursday suppers with Clara and James. And Thomas, who was 4.5 and possessed of a determined practical intelligence that made him more help than many adults, became very seriously committed to the project of managing his younger brother, which Robert resisted with the full force of his considerable personality. When Marcus came back, he was different in a way that was subtle and not subtle. He was settled, in a way that she recognized as the settling that comes when you have returned to a place that made you and made your peace with it, and come back to where you live now knowing that both places are yours. He brought back a quilt his mother had made, pieced from fabric that went back to before his father died, and a letter she had written for Lillian, which Lillian read alone in the kitchen, and then folded and put with the important papers in the tin box under the floorboard, next to her father's deed to the land. He brought Thomas and Robert small wooden horses that his brother James had carved, because it turned out carpentry was a family talent, and Thomas received his with the methodical appreciation of a child assessing a new object's properties, and Robert received his and immediately used it to knock on the floor in a complex rhythmic pattern that suggested he had been waiting for exactly this instrument. Samuel Cooper came to Harlow Creek the following winter. He was the youngest of the 3 brothers, 23 years old, with a quality of easy warmth that was different from Marcus's contained steadiness, but recognizably from the same source. He came ostensibly to visit, but was also, as he admitted within the first day, looking for somewhere to start over after a difficult end to a farming partnership in Texas that had left him with skills and no operation to apply them to. He stayed through the winter. By spring he had found a piece of land north of town that was available for homesteading, and had filed the claim with the Territorial Land Office, and Marcus had helped him plan the first season's work, and he had become a fixed element of the Harlow Creek landscape, which now contained 3 Cooper brothers, 2 Cooper wives, 2 Cooper children with the probability of more, and a post office managed by the 3rd Cooper wife-in-waiting. Though Clara technically still operated under her original name for professional purposes, Harlow Creek in 1889 was a different town from the one Lillian had arrived in 7 years earlier. The railroad had brought more people, and more people had brought more commerce, and more commerce had brought a proper school, which Thomas Ford Cooper entered in the autumn of 1889 at the age of 4 and immediately announced he had opinions about, and 2 churches, and a second saloon that was quieter and more respectable than Harlan Cross's establishment, which had declined as Harlan Cross's influence had declined. The man himself having become progressively less relevant as the town grew around him in directions that did not particularly require his approval. The school mattered to Lillian in a way that connected to the crate of books and the teacher in Ohio, and everything she had understood about the world being larger than any one corner of it. She became involved with the school board, which was a new institution in Harlow Creek, and pushed consistently for the hiring of a teacher who understood that education was not a sorting mechanism but an opening, which was a position that was occasionally contested, and which she held without wavering. Marcus watched her in those meetings, occasionally accompanying her on the evenings when the board met, and what he saw confirmed what he had known since the evening she told him she looked forward to Saturdays more than any other day of the week. That Lillian Ford Cooper was a woman of particular and specific quality, not general goodness but something more precise, a person who had decided what she believed about the world and arranged her life accordingly, and did not ask the world to accommodate her beliefs, but simply persisted in them until the world adjusted. It was not always easy. The territory was still, in 1889, a place where a great deal depended on who you were and where you came from and what you looked like. And Marcus navigated this with the practical intelligence he had always applied to it, choosing his battles with care and winning the ones he chose. And there were battles that could not be won simply because the forces arrayed against winning them were too large and too structural for any one man to overturn by persistence. And those he noted and carried and did not pretend were not there, because pretending things did not exist was not a strategy he had ever found useful. What he had found useful, and what continued to be useful, was the particular quality of the life he had built. The ranch in the morning with the mountains in clear light, Thomas in the parlor with a book that he was already reading better than most children twice his age, Robert creating elaborate arrangements of objects on the kitchen floor and explaining their significance in the serious voice of a person who considers the kitchen floor a serious arena of inquiry. Lillian across the table from him in the evening, talking about the school board or the cattle or the things she had read, with that quality of attention that had not changed in 7 years except to deepen. He came home one evening in October of 1889 to find Lillian in the kitchen with the brass lantern in her hands, not because she was using it, but because she had been cleaning the shelves and had taken it down to polish it, and was now holding it with the expression of a person who has picked something up intending a simple task, and found themselves looking at something more complicated than a piece of brass. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him, watching her hold the lantern with the light from the kitchen lamp moving across its surface, and he felt the weight of the years between November 1882 and this particular October evening like a physical quality of the air, not heavy but substantial, the way a good structure is substantial, present because it has been built with care. She heard him and looked up, and her face changed in the way it still changed when he came into a room, not dramatically but specifically, a small adjustment of expression that meant she was glad he was there, and he crossed the kitchen and put his hand on her shoulder and looked at the lantern with her. "I should have come back for it sooner," he said. "You came back," she said. "That's what matters." He kissed the top of her head, and she leaned back against him slightly. And outside the Arizona October was cooling toward what would be another territory winter. And in the parlor, Thomas was reading to Robert from a picture book with the slightly condescending patience of a 5-year-old educating a 3-year-old. And in the house next door, which James and Clara had built the previous year close enough to the main house to be convenient without being crowded, there was lamp light in the window and the sound of voices. Lillian set the lantern back on the shelf. It had always been on that shelf, and it always would be, and she had long since stopped thinking of it as borrowed or forgotten, had started thinking of it instead as the specific object that had been the hinge point of her life, the small brass reason that had brought a man to her door on a cold November evening who had stepped inside and stayed. The years kept coming. In 1890, Lillian had their third child, a daughter they named Elena for Marcus's mother, who wept when the letter arrived in San Antonio, and who Marcus's brother Samuel reported had carried the letter to the church to read it again in what she described as appropriate surroundings. Elena arrived in the world with her father's steadiness already apparent in the way she regarded her brothers, who regarded her back with the mix of awe and proprietary interest that older brothers bring to new sisters. Thomas declared himself responsible for her education. Robert declared himself responsible for her entertainment. Elena, at 2 weeks old, seemed to have already formed an opinion about both propositions. Clara and James had a son in 1891, which completed the particular configuration of the Harlow Creek Cooper family, and the two households became the kind of neighboring families that share meals and tools and labor, and the particular knowledge of each other that comes from proximity and time, and the decision to be, genuinely, in each other's lives. The debt was long paid. The cattle were doing well. The ranch was a real operation now, with hands working it and the books showing a profit that was modest but reliable and growing. Marcus had ridden enough drives to have a reputation that extended well beyond Harlow Creek, and the Millrock partnership was solid, and he was known in the territory as a man whose word meant what it said, and whose judgment about cattle and range, and weather was worth consulting, which was the kind of reputation that had taken years to build, and which he valued without placing more weight on it than it deserved. Lillian had the school running the way she believed schools should run, with a teacher named Miss Ardmore who had come from Illinois, and who had the same philosophy about education as an opening rather than a sorting, and the two of them had a productive working relationship based on shared conviction and mutual respect. The seamstress work had become something she shared with 3 other women in Harlow Creek, having successfully transferred most of the technique, and she kept a few of her favorite clients because she still liked the work, and because it kept her hands busy on the long evenings when Marcus was on the range. Thomas started school in the formal sense when he was 6, though he had been educating himself for years, and the school primarily gave him more books and a teacher who could answer the specific questions his parents could not. He was patient and focused and relentlessly curious, with a gift for mathematics that appeared to have come from nowhere in particular, and which Marcus quietly considered a miracle. Robert was entirely different, louder and more social, with a gift for making people feel comfortable that would serve him all his life, and which was already evident in the way he managed the complicated politics of the schoolyard. Elena was 4 and simply herself, which was considerable. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet and Clara and James were in their house next door, and Samuel's light was visible on the north property, Marcus and Lillian sat together the way they had always sat, by the fire or at the pine table which her father had built, and which Marcus had repaired so many times it was now partly his work as well as Thomas Ford's, and they talked or were quiet, and either was sufficient. She was 31 years old in the autumn of 1889, and she had been in Harlow Creek for 7 years, and she had arrived alone with a cattle spread and a debt and a dead father, and a long braid and creek-colored eyes, and she had fixed fence lines by lantern light, and ridden to Tucson for a legal case, and married a man who had noticed a meadowlark and carved it for her from juniper wood, and she had learned that the territory rewarded commitment in the way her father had believed it would, which was not by being easy, but by being sufficient to the person who approached it with the right kind of persistence. She was happy. This was not a small thing, and she did not treat it as one. She had known enough unhappiness, enough loss and enough solitude, and enough cold evenings managing alone in the particular quiet of a house that had once held more people, to understand what happiness felt like when she had it, and she had it. Had it in the specific way that comes from building a life deliberately, and choosing the right person to build it with, and waking up every morning in the Arizona territory, with the mountains in the window, and the sound of children moving in the house, and the smell of coffee on the stove, and the knowledge that the man sleeping beside her was a man she was still, after all these years, genuinely glad to see each morning. Marcus was 35 in 1889, and he had been in Harlow Creek for 7 years, and he had arrived alone with a good horse, and a recommendation for honest work, and a history of navigating a world that had not always been designed with him in mind. And he had found, in this particular mesa-walled valley in the Arizona territory, something he had not expected to find when he rode in from the direction of Tucson on a dark bay horse in late September of 1882. He had found work that rewarded his skill without qualification, and a town that was imperfect but capable of growth, and a woman who held his hand at a pine table in December, and invited him inside out of the cold, and who had never, not once in all the years since, made him feel that the person he was anything less than the person the world had needed him to be. The brass lantern sat on the shelf through all of it, polished and present, lit occasionally when needed, a small ordinary object that had performed an extraordinary service by being borrowed, and then not quite returned and then forgotten on a shelf, where it had become a permanent part of a kitchen that was also, by the evidence of everything around it, a permanent part of a life. On an evening in November 1889, exactly 7 years from the evening that Lillian Ford had walked half a mile in the cold to borrow a lantern from her neighbor above the feed store, Marcus came home late from the range, and Lillian lit the brass lantern to set on the porch, because the regular lamp was already in use in the parlor where Thomas was reading. And the brass lantern's warm light was on the porch steps when Marcus rode up and swung down from his horse and came up the steps and kissed her in the lantern light in the cold November air. He looked at the lantern and then at her and said nothing, because some things close themselves without words, and he took her hand and they went inside out of the cold, and the door closed behind them, and the lantern stayed on the porch for another hour, burning warmly in the dark, lighting the porch and the steps and the small circle of the yard around it, before the oil ran low and the flame guttered, and the Arizona Territory night came in close around the house where Lillian and Marcus Cooper were home, and settled and entirely at peace. The morning came clear and cold, as November mornings in the Territory do, and the mountains were purple, and the sky was the hard, deep blue that does not appear anywhere else on earth in quite that particular shade. And inside the Ford Cooper ranch Thomas was already awake and reading, and Robert was explaining something at considerable volume to Alina, who was listening with the patience of someone who has decided to let the speaker finish before forming her response. And Marcus was building up the kitchen fire while Lillian made coffee, and outside Samuel's smoke was rising from the north property, and James and Clara's house had its lamp lit, and Harlow Creek was waking up around them the way towns wake up, slowly and imperfectly, and full of the ordinary complexity of people living their lives. Lillian poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the pine table. Marcus sat down across from her and wrapped both hands around his cup, and she sat across from him, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and moved across the table between them, and the brass lantern on the shelf caught it the way it always did, warm and specific, and the day, like all the days before it and all the days ahead, began.